This is for all of us.
What the hell? My laptop!
Hey, what's going on here?
You're finished! You think you can get away with this?
I don't know what you're talking about.
Liar, you sabotaged everything!
Get your hands off me.
This isn't over! What is this?
An accident, sir.
This is unacceptable.
I'll handle it.
You just cost me everything, the millionaire screamed at the janitor. 40 seconds later, he was on his knees. Garrett Mercer was on his feet before the glass finished breaking. The whiskey ran across the marble in a thin amber sheet, soaking into the corner of an open laptop, sliding under a leather portfolio worth more than the boy who had knocked it over, earned in a month. People at the surrounding tables looked up, then looked down, the way people do when violence has not arrived yet, but everyone can feel it coming. The boy stood frozen with a folded white cloth in one hand. Do you have any idea what that is? Garrett's voice did not rise so much as flatten, which was worse, because men who shout are still asking to be understood, and men who flatten have already decided you are not a person. He stepped around the low table, his shoes leaving wet prints in the spill, and pointed one finger an inch from the young man's chest. Behind him, the laptop screen flickered and went dark. The portfolio, the contracts inside it, the $41,000 watch on the wrist that pointed, all of it caught the warm, recessed light of the Aurelian Club at 11:41 at night. The boy's name was Andre Coleman. He was 23 years old, and he had been mopping the far end of the lounge for the better part of an hour, and the uniform he wore was a size and a half too large because it had belonged to whoever cleaned this room before him. He did not step back. He looked, for one strange half-second, not at Garrett's face but past his shoulder, toward a man in a charcoal gray suit who sat very still in the leather chair by the window. "I'm sorry, sir," Andre said. "It slipped. It slipped." Garrett laughed once, a short, ugly sound with nothing behind it. He reached into his jacket, pulled out his billfold, peeled off a $100 bill, and let it drop into the puddle of whiskey on the floor. "That's what you're for. Get down there and clean it up before I have you walked out of this building in front of every person in this room." He looked around at the other travelers, inviting them to agree with him, and not one of them met his eyes. "Some of us," he said, "have somewhere to be." He had a flight in 53 minutes. Gate B14, the 11:50 to Geneva, and a board meeting at 9 the next morning that would decide whether the company he had built over 26 years still belonged to him. He did not know yet that he would never board that plane. He did not know that the clumsy boy he was looking at like something stuck to his shoe had just, 40 seconds earlier, saved his life. And he did not know that the man in the gray suit by the window, the man he trusted more than his own brother, had paid to end it. The Aurelian Club sat on the 4th floor of Concourse C, behind frosted glass doors that opened only for the people the world had already decided to be gentle with. Inside, it was hushed and warm and the color of money. Low amber lighting, leather the color of strong tea, a long marble bar where a single bartender polished glasses that were already clean. Through the floor-to-soiling windows, the runway lay out in the dark, a grid of blue and white lights, planes crawling and lifting and vanishing into a sky you could not see. It was the kind of room built to make a certain kind of person feel that the rules outside did not apply to them in here. Andre got down on his knees. He picked the $100 bill out of the spill, and for a moment something flickered across his face. He could have used that money, every dollar of it, the way a drowning man can use air, and then he set it on the edge of the table, soaked and curling, and did not keep it. He wiped the floor in slow, even circles. He wiped under the table and along the chair leg, and he did it the way his mother had taught him to do everything, fully, without complaint, as though someone were always watching even when no one ever was. His hands were steady now. They had not been steady 4 minutes ago, at the bar, when he had seen what he had seen. "Where is your manager?" Garrett said above him. "I'll find her, sir." "You'll do better than find her. You'll bring her here." Diane Pruitt had managed the night shift at the Aurelian Club for 9 years, and she arrived the way she always did when a platinum member raised his voice, fast and apologizing before she knew what she was apologizing for. She was 56. She had a son in his second year of college and a lease that went up every spring and a husband whose hours had been cut at the plant, and all of that lived behind her eyes when men like Garrett Mercer spoke to her, even though her face gave away none of it. She looked at the dark laptop. She looked at the soaked portfolio. She looked at Andre on his knees with the cloth in his hand, and something in her chest went tight because she had hired him 11 days ago, and she had liked him, and she already knew how this was going to go. Mr. Mercer, I am so sorry. We'll cover the cleaning, the laptop, anything that was damaged. I'll personally. I don't want it covered. Garrett's voice had found its edge now. I want him gone, tonight. I want it understood that this is what happens. He gestured at Andre without looking at him. People like this do not belong in a room like this. You let them in to mop the floors, and they think the room is theirs. The bartender stopped polishing the glass. A woman 2 tables over, elderly, in a gray traveling coat with a brooch shaped like a sparrow at her collar, set down her tea and watched. Nobody else moved. There were perhaps 14 people in the lounge, and every one of them had decided that the safest thing to be in that moment was furniture. Andre stood. He was taller than Garrett by half a head, and for a moment the size of him seemed to surprise the older man, and then Andre's shoulders came down and his eyes went to the floor, and he made himself small again the way the world had taught him to do a long time ago. He had learned that lesson at 15, in a different city, with a different man yelling, and he had learned it again at 19 and again at 21, and the lesson was always the same. You do not win these. You only survive them. I understand, sir, he said quietly. But he kept glancing at the man in the gray suit. His name was Daniel Rourke, and Garrett Mercer had loved him the way you can only love someone you have bled beside. They had started the company together in a rented office above a tire shop in 1999, 2 men with a folding table and a phone that only sometimes worked, and they had nearly lost it 3 times. And each time they had stayed up through the same nights, eating the same cold food, and promising each other the same things. Rourke had been the best man at Garrett's wedding. He had carried one corner of the casket at Garrett's wife's funeral 2 years ago and had been the only person Garrett let see him cry. There was no one alive Garrett trusted more, which was the thing about trust. It did not protect you from anyone. It only told you who would be close enough to do it. To understand what Andre had seen, you have to go back 11 minutes, to the long marble bar at the quiet end of the lounge. Andre had been wiping the bar rail down near the service station, where the bartender left the dirty rags, when Garrett and Rourke had come in together, late mid-conversation, the way important men arrive everywhere. Garrett had taken the leather chair by the window. Rourke had gone to the bar. He had ordered 2 of the same, a single malt, neat, the kind they kept on the high shelf, and the bartender had poured them and then turned away to ring it up. And in that turning away, in that 2-second window, where no one in the world was looking, Daniel Rourke had taken something small and pale from his jacket pocket and dropped it into the left-hand glass and stirred it once with his own finger. He had done it smoothly. He had done it the way a man does a thing he has rehearsed in his head 100 times in the dark, and he would have gotten away with it cleanly. Except that Andre Coleman, 23 years old, invisible in his too big uniform, had been standing 4 feet away with a rag in his hand, and the long mirror behind the bar had shown him everything. Andre had not understood it at first. A man putting something in a drink, a pill, a sweetener, anything. People did strange private things. But then Rourke had picked up the 2 glasses, the clean one and the other one, and he had carried them to the window, and Andre had watched which hand held which, and he had watched Rourke set the doctored glass down in front of Garrett and keep the clean one for himself, and something cold had walked up the back of his neck. He had heard it the night before. That was the part he had not told anyone, because there was no one to tell and no reason anyone would believe a janitor over a man in a gray suit. Night before, closing the lounge alone at 1 in the morning, Andre had been emptying the bins in the corridor behind the members' restrooms when he heard a voice through the half-open door of the private phone room. Low, careful, a man who thought he was alone. The boy had not meant to listen, but the words had reached him anyway, in pieces, the way the worst things always do. By the time he lands, it'll already be done. He's got the heart history, the stent, 2 years on the medication. Nobody questions a 54-year-old man with a bad heart who doesn't wake up over the Atlantic. The vote is at 9. As long as he never makes the room, it doesn't matter how he doesn't make it. Andre had stood in that corridor with a bag of trash in his hand and his own heart going like a fist on a door. He had not seen the man's face. He had only heard the voice. And he had done the one thing a poor kid with no power and no proof learns to do, which is to take out the cracked phone he kept in his shirt pocket, the one with the screen held together by a strip of clear tape, and press record and catch the last 40 seconds of it before the voice said goodbye to no one and hung up. He had told himself, walking home that night through the cold, that he had imagined it, that it was a business call. A turn of phrase, nothing. He had told himself that for 18 hours, and then a man in a gray suit had stood at the bar and dropped something pale into a glass of single malt, and Andre Coleman had understood that he had not imagined any of it, and that he was now the only person in the world who knew. He had a choice in that moment. It would be a lie to say he didn't. He could have done nothing. He could have kept wiping the bar and let the man at the window drink what was poured for him and let whatever happened at 38,000 feet happen, and no one had been 4 feet away with the truth in his pocket. No one expected anything of him. That was the thing about being invisible. It came with a kind of terrible permission. The man whose life hung on the next 60 seconds not so much as looked at him, and Andre was so tired. He was tired in the way that has nothing to do with sleep. His mother had died 14 months ago in a hospital that was still sending him letters about $11,000 he did not have, and he worked nights here and mornings somewhere else, and the world had made it very clear to him, over and over, exactly how much it valued a young man like him, which was not at all. So why should he spend himself, risk his job, his standing, the only paycheck keeping him housed, to save the kind of man who would step over him without seeing him? He thought about it for the length of one breath. Then he crossed the room, and as Garrett Mercer lifted the glass toward his mouth, Andre Coleman reached out with his cloth as though to wipe the table and knocked it clean out of his hand. That was how the whiskey ended up on the marble. That was the spill that started everything. And that was why Andre was now standing in the middle of the Aurelian Club, being told he was nothing by the man he had just saved, while the man who had tried to kill that man sat watching from the window with his hands folded and his face arranged into perfect, sympathetic concern. "Garrett," Rourke said now, rising, smooth as ever. "Let it go. It's a glass." He came forward and put a hand on his partner's shoulder, the gesture of a lifetime, and he smiled at Diane and even, briefly, at Andre, and the smile did not reach anything. "We've got a plane to catch. Let me get you another, and we'll forget the whole thing." He was already turning toward the bar. "Sit down. Catch your breath. You've had a long day." And there it was. He was going to pour it again. Andre felt the room tilt. If Garrett sat back down and let Rourke bring him a fresh glass, then knocking the first one over had bought nothing. It had only cost him his job and earned him a humiliation, and the man would still die over the ocean, and Rourke would still walk off the plane in Geneva and into a boardroom and take everything, and there would be no second clumsy janitor to save him. The window was closing. It was closing right now, in the time it took a man in a gray suit to walk 11 feet to a bar. Andre stepped in front of Garrett Mercer. "Don't drink anything he brings you." The lounge went very quiet. Garrett blinked, the insult on his face curdling into something else, something confused. "What did you just say to me?" "I said don't drink it." Andre's voice was low, and it did not shake. Not from him. Not from anyone tonight. He was breathing hard. "The glass I knocked over. I didn't slip. He put something in it. At the bar, before he brought it to you. I watched him do it in the mirror." He turned, slowly, and for the first time he looked directly at Daniel Rourke, and he pointed at him the way Garrett had pointed at him 3 minutes earlier. "Him, the man you trust. He's been trying to kill you all night." For a moment, nobody breathed. Then Rourke laughed, warm and easy and devastating. "Garrett, listen to this. The boy breaks a glass. He's about to lose his job, and now, suddenly, there's a... What is it?" He spread his hands to the room, generous, baffled, a poisoning, a conspiracy. He shook his head with the sorrow of a reasonable man. He's frightened. He's grasping. I understand it. I do. But you cannot seriously. I have it on my phone. The laugh stopped. It was a small thing, the way it stopped. It did not stop all at once. It died in stages across Daniel Rourke's face, the corners of his mouth coming down a half-second too late, his eyes going from the boy to the cracked phone Andre had pulled from his shirt pocket and was holding up between two fingers, and in that half-second Garrett Mercer saw it. He had known this man for 22 years. He had watched him lie to bankers and charm regulators and hold his nerve in rooms full of people who wanted him to break, and he had never once, in all that time, seen Daniel Rourke afraid. He saw it now. Last night, Andre said, in the phone room off the back corridor. You didn't know anyone was there. He pressed the screen. You said by the time he lands, it'll already be done. You said nobody questions a 54-year-old man with a bad heart who doesn't wake up over the Atlantic. You said the vote is at 9. He pressed play. The voice that came out of the small, cracked speaker was thin and tinny and unmistakable. It filled the hushed room the way a single wrong note fills a concert hall. It was Daniel Rourke's voice, low and careful, a man who thought he was alone, and it said the words again, the same words, in the same order, and there was no charm in it now and no warmth and nothing at all that a man could hide behind. Garrett Mercer did not move while it played. He stood in the wet print of his own spilled drink, and he listened to his oldest friend plan his death in 40 seconds of audio. His face did something that none of the 14 strangers in that room would ever forget. It was not rage. The rage would come later. In that moment, it was something closer to grief, the specific and bottomless grief of a man watching the floor of his whole life give way beneath him, because the worst thing Rourke had stolen was not the company and not the next 18 years. It was the 22 that had already happened. It was every cold night above the tire shop. It was the corner of the casket. The recording ended. The lounge held its breath. Rourke ran. He was halfway to the frosted glass doors before anyone understood he had moved, and it was the bartender, of all people, who stepped out from behind the marble and put a shoulder into him, and then two of the strangers who had been furniture were suddenly men again, and Rourke went down against a leather chair with a sound that was almost gentle. Diane was already on her radio, her voice high and fast, calling for airport security to Concourse C, the Aurelian Club. Now. The elderly woman in the gray coat had risen to her feet without seeming to decide to, and Garrett Mercer stood in the center of all of it, perfectly still, looking at the man on the floor as though he had never seen him before in his life. Why? Garrett said. It was not a question. It was the only word he had left. Rourke looked up at him from the floor, and the mask was gone, and what was underneath it was almost worse because it was not a monster. It was just a tired man. You were going to vote me out, Garrett. Tomorrow. You and the board, you had the numbers. His voice was flat and exhausted, a confession that had been waiting a long time to be made. 31 years I gave this. 31. And you were going to walk me to the door with a handshake and a parking space named after me. He laughed, and it broke in the middle. I had nothing left. I have a daughter at a school I can't pay for, and a second mortgage you don't know about, and a name that's only worth something as long as it's next to yours. You'd have been fine. You're always fine. I was going to be nothing. He looked away. I told myself it would be quick. I told myself you wouldn't feel it. It was not an excuse. There is no version of those words that is an excuse. But it was a reason, and Garrett heard it, and the hearing of it was its own kind of wound, because he understood that he had spent 22 years not seeing the man beside him, in exactly the way he had spent 2 minutes not seeing the boy in front of him. He had a gift for not seeing people. It had made him rich. Tonight it had very nearly made him dead. Security came through the frosted doors in a rush of dark uniforms and radios. They lifted Daniel Rourke off the floor, and they took the cracked phone from Andre's hand, gently, with a receipt, and somewhere below them on the ramp the 1150 to Geneva pushed back from the gate without 2 of its passengers and lifted into the sky Garrett would not die in. The whole thing, from the broken glass to the handcuffs, had taken not quite 11 minutes. When it was over, when the room had emptied of everyone but the people it had happened to, Garrett Mercer turned and looked at Andre Coleman for the first time. Really looked. at the uniform a size and a half too big, at the worn place on the toe of one shoe where the leather had given up, at the strip of clear tape holding a cracked phone together, the phone that had held the only proof that his life was worth saving. And Garrett's hand went to his jacket, the same motion as before, the billfold, the reflex of a man who had only ever known one way to make a thing right. He stopped. The $100 bill was still there on the edge of the table, soaked and curling, where Andre had set it down and not kept it. Garrett looked at it. He looked at it for a long time, and then, slowly, in his $11,000 suit, 54 years old, with a stent in his chest and his whole life rearranged in the space of a single hour, Garrett Mercer got down on his knees on the wet marble floor, the floor he had ordered the boy onto, and he picked up the ruined bill, and he held it the way you hold something you finally understand. He did not offer it. He had understood at last that there was no number that touched this. He simply knelt there, on the floor, beside the young man he had called nothing, and after a moment Andre crouched down across from him, because it seemed wrong to leave a man on his knees alone, and the two of them stayed like that, eye to eye on the cold marble, while the lounge lights burned warm and amber over their heads and the planes lifted off into the dark beyond the glass. "What's your name?" Garrett said. "Andre." "Andre." He said it carefully, the way you say a word you intend to remember. "Why?" He shook his head. "I put you on this floor. I called you, in front of all these people, I called you nothing. You hurt me." His voice cracked. "You owed me nothing. Less than nothing. Why would you?" Andre thought about the $11,000. He thought about his mother, who had cleaned offices at night so that he would never have to, and who had cleaned them anyway right up until the end, fully without complaint, as though someone were always watching even when no one ever was. He thought about how easy it would have been to keep wiping the bar. "Because somebody was going to know," he said, "and it was me." He shrugged, an exhausted 23-year-old shrug. "I figured if I just kept quiet, then some of it was mine too." Garrett Mercer did not have an answer for that. He had built towers and bought companies, and his name was on the side of buildings in 3 cities, and he did not have a single thing, in all of it, that answered a sentence that simple. So he did the only thing that was left. He reached out, on his knees on the floor of the Aurelian Club, and he shook the hand of the man who had saved his life. And he held on a little longer than a handshake, and neither of them said anything else, because there was nothing else that needed saying. The story made the news, of course, the way these stories do. There was a version where Andre Coleman was a hero, and a version where he was lucky, and a version where the millionaire's instincts had saved them both, depending on which channel you watched and what it wanted you to believe. Daniel Rourke was charged with things that carry numbers in front of the word years. The 9 o'clock vote never happened. The company went on without him, and the parking space was never named. But that is not the part worth keeping. The part worth keeping is what came in the mail 6 weeks later to a one-room apartment on the wrong side of a city most people never have to think about. It was not a check. Andre had been clear about that, on the floor, in the only conversation the two of them ever needed to have, and Garrett Mercer had heard him, possibly for the first time in his life hearing a person all the way through. It was a plain white envelope, and inside it was a single sheet of paper, and on the paper, in a fountain pen hand that did not shake, were 3 sentences. "The hospital is paid. The debt is gone. Not because you saved me, but because I finally saw you, and a man like you should not spend his nights on his knees for anyone." There was no signature. There did not need to be. Andre read it twice. Then he folded it along its one crease and set it on the windowsill of the room his mother had never seen, in the warm rectangle of light that came in every morning whether anyone was watching or not, and he went to work. If you've ever been the invisible one in the room, the one people step over, the one they decide isn't worth seeing, tell me one thing in the comments. Tell me about the moment someone finally saw you. I read every single one. And if this story moved you, stay a moment longer and let me know where in the world you're watching from tonight. There's a whole room of us here who would have knelt down on that floor with him. I'd like to know your name too.